Well, welcome everyone to our fifth presentation from a recently launched MSD at Home series. My name is Alan Perton, I'm Director of the Melbourne School of Design. And I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the lands in which we gather, and I pay my respects to their elders, past, present and emerging, and extend that respect to other Indigenous Australians who may be present. Now, it's a huge pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker, Professor Ricky Burdett from the London School of Economics and Political Science. As Professor of Urban Studies, Ricky leads LSE Cities, a global centre of research and teaching. And it was here that Ricky also founded the Authoritative Urban Age programme back in 2005. The Urban Age conferences have become globally significant, and they're aimed at bringing together planners, mayors, architects, academics, and other stakeholders to discuss themes such as urban health and well-being, urban governance, and how cities respond to the impact of major events like the hosting of the Olympic Games. The Urban Age programme has also seen the publication of three significant books: The Endless City from 2008, Living the Endless City from 2011, and more recently, Shaping Cities in an Urban Age, which became available through Faden in 2018. Now, Ricky also acts as a consultant to national and city governments, and he's acted as advisor to the Mayor of London from 2001 to 2006, importantly when London put together their bid for the Olympics. In 2006, Ricky was also the curator of the Venice Architecture Biennale titled Cities, Architecture and Society. Now, the title of Ricky's talk tonight, Making a Piece of the City, relates to his role as Chief Advisor on Architecture and Urbanism for the 2012 London Olympics. Now, you might ask yourself why this is of any relevance to us here in Australia. But as we transition out of COVID-19, we're also about to embark on one of Australia's largest and most ambitious urban renewal projects at Fisherman's Bend. No doubt a key focus of the government's stimulus packages to be announced next month. At 480 hectares, Fisherman's Bend is double the size of the Olympic Park, as well as their own CBD, and estimated to accommodate up to 80,000 residents by 2050, which should also be considered alongside the recently predicted population rise of 11.2 million by 2056. Now, there are also parallels with the University of Melbourne looking to open a campus similar to UCL's Here East, which I'm sure Ricky will touch on. Importantly, the London Olympics were not conceived simply as a two-week sporting event. It was the beginning of a plan for the 30-year transformation of the East End of the city. And as Ricky has been quoted as saying in the past, Olympics are fantastic opportunities to fuck up cities. So the question is, 8 years on, is London getting it right? And has the 18 billion cost been money well spent? Ricky, can I invite you to reflect on an evolving story that is London 2012?
Alan, thank you very much. I hope you can hear me and possibly even see me.
Yep.
So let me just check that, and good afternoon, good evening to all of you in Melbourne. I'm delighted to have this global discussion about the future of cities. And we're really using, as Alan has said, the example of one project in London to talk about how cities can be better planned, managed and designed. But my title really deals with something which I think is important to anyone becoming an architect in the mid-21st century, that you can't think of it as just a piece of design. It's really making a piece of city in the social, in the environmental, in the cultural, and in the political sense. And that's very much the way I want to frame my talk, by giving you an overview of London as a city. It could be Melbourne, it could be Sydney, it could be elsewhere, in order to then understand how the specific project for London 2012 fits into what I call the DNA of London itself. So let me start by taking you to London. Many of you know the city. This is a view actually taken from a helicopter 3 nights ago. Looking east with the River Thames in the middle. It hasn't been touched up. The sun setting from the west, and therefore we're looking east. And as you can see from even this picture, it just goes on and on and on. London is a vast city. It's a relatively low density global city. And it has, you can see from this image, a series of hotspots of concentrations of urban development, often connected to public transport. But it's also, we'll see in a moment, an image of a social map. It's not just a physical map. Basically, the more you look east, and you can see the river winding its way outwards towards the North Sea and what used to be the global British Empire in the 18th and 19th century, you see today also a social map of a city more deprived as you go east, and actually more affluent from where the helicopter view is now, more west. I'll come to these images, but it's just important to visualize it as you see it now. So any image, any picture, any map of a city is more than just its architecture, and therefore how you intervene in it is exactly what I want to, in a way, share with you. I'm going to be talking specifically, as Alan has already introduced, about the transformation of a part of London, what used to be called the Stratford Railway Lands, and this is a picture of it taken in 2005. And I'm going to go through that as an example of how the planners, but also the policymakers, saw this as a way of beginning to transform some structural issues that have affected London, not for the last years, but for the last decades or even centuries. Structural differences in the sense that there's always been an underserviced and underprovided East, and quite the opposite West, and we'll see all that. So these images that you can see just going back from Transformation 2005, a CGI of the architects and planners of what it might look like in maybe 2030 and beyond, is actually more or less where we are now. This is again an aerial photograph taken of the Olympic Park. That big white building on the right-hand side I'll refer to is called Here East. Alan has already talked about it, as where the university, one of the major universities of London, University College London, has a series of activities. You can see a park with water, the stadium in the background, but most importantly is what happens from the left to the right of this image. It's literally making from nothing a piece of city. Changing cities is not neutral. People get pissed off. I'm delighted that Alan introduced the phrase, one of my more eloquent, thoughtful analysis of what it means to work with a city and try and change it, that you can really fuck it up. Well, a lot of people who live and lived on the fringes of this part of the city were and are not particularly happy with what's happened. On the other hand, the politics of it is very clear. Only a few years ago, the government, rightly to my mind, celebrated the fact that actually in an area which has been performing for, as I say, decades, actually has created something like 100,000 and more jobs. So it's the tension between this and this, which is also triggered by the design that we're going to go through. But as I said earlier, what I want to do is very quickly run through what London is, what is London's spatial, economic, and social DNA, so that for those of you who don't know the city as intimately as I have come to know it, you understand what this project is about. And let me stress what Alan said. It's a 2-week event, but the impact hopefully is going to be a 20, 30-year transformation of not just the physical fabric, but the way people live in this city. What you see here is a map, produced by my group at LSE Cities, of the density of the southeast of England. And you can see, and I think if I put the mouse around it, Alan, is the mouse working? Does it show, right? You can see London itself, Greater London, is where these vertical elements, which show the density of habitation, are more pronounced. And what you can actually see is a couple of things. One is that it's a relatively low density city. I've already mentioned that. The taller the spike, the more people live closer together, not the taller the buildings. So if this were New York or Hong Kong, yes, you might have taller buildings, but you have much higher densities. And what you also see here, and I go to the next slide, is that the edge of that density stops quite dramatically. And the reason is because in the 1940s, one of the great planners of our country, one of the great planners full stop, invented, Sir Patrick Abercrombie, invented the green belt. It's such a simple idea. You just put a stop to where the city grows, then you put maybe 20, 30 kilometers of agricultural land effectively around it. And then, of course, as many of you know, you build new towns around the edges and you connect it with forms of transport. This system has served London incredibly well for the last now 70 years. And of course, the more these radial connections are green, as in trains and subways, as opposed to car, the better. And the experience that we're going through, the transformations as a result of COVID, obviously affect and impact on these issues, and we might talk about that a bit later. But at the same time that the Green Belt was invented and the first London plan of the 40s was designed and conceived, this extraordinary drawing was done of London. And what it shows is, it's referred to, by the way, in the industry as the potato diagram. This is London shown with different hubs of activity. In the red area, it's the West End with theatres and entertainments. The city is the financial hub. And importantly for our conversation today, here on the right-hand side, along the river, is industry, warehousing, and shipping. Now, this image I want you to keep in your mind when we come back to the plans as evolved and as developed for London Olympics 2012. Another aerial view of the same thing shows that this city is really relatively organic, perhaps messy. It doesn't have the clarity of the Barcelona grid of Manhattan, for example. And the Olympic site, you see the river winding its way eastwards. The Olympic site is up here, and just again, bear that in mind for reasons that we'll make clear. This was an area that until not that long ago, 1970s, was actually incredibly active with ships, and the docks employed something like 300,000-400,000 people. All of this completely collapsed with containerization. This has happened, of course, across the world, particularly the Western world. And many of these areas, which were a source of income, a source of community, a source of urban livelihood, became like this. In fact, this is a picture taken not long ago, in fact, last year, in the Royal Docks, looking backwards towards Canary Wharf and the Millennium Dome. There are still vast swathes of empty ex-industrial land available in London. Perhaps the most important image I want you to now keep in your mind after that potato diagram is this one. And it's central to understanding the whole Olympics project. What it is a brain scan of London, literally like a slice through the surface, which shows in red the most deprived areas and in green the most affluent, the least deprived. And what you can see, again, I've alluded to this in my description of the pictures at the beginning. There is the River Thames going east. This is where all the dock areas were. And it's not a surprise that after the collapse of the industries of the 70s, the most deprived areas, people with higher unemployment, lower life expectancy, less education, and so it goes on, are concentrated, in fact, in these areas here. And you'll see these names: Tower Hamlets, Hackney, Waltham Forest, Newham. These are the names of the boroughs, the London boroughs, of which there are 33, right around the Olympic site. And they are by far the most deprived, not only in London, but across the whole of England. We'll come back to that. What is interesting, just for you to note, and I wonder, Alan, how it works in Melbourne, but the edge of the city is affluent, and the west of the city is affluent. If you did this in Paris, it would be exactly the opposite. The center of the city would be affluent, and the periphery would be deprived. Each city has its own DNA. Why is this image so important? Because the Olympic site is right there. So if you're going to spend a lot of public money, it's not a bad idea to spend it in an area that needs it more than elsewhere. And that's the story of the Olympics. As a member of the London School of Economics, we need to do serious analytical diagrams, and probably this a little bit summarizes the way London really works. There's one part of it which is for the very rich, the global rich maybe, and the rest of it for us and others is for the losers. There's a serious part to this, which is one needs to understand the social DNA before intervening. Another map which shows not social deprivation and affluence, but actually the equivalent in public transport is equally significant. Here again is London. You see the outline, you see the central areas, and in purple, you have the highest level of public transport connectivity. Basically, you can get in and out to any part of London in less than half an hour. In red, it's roughly 45 minutes, and then yellow, and then green, and then blue is the least well connected, obviously the suburbs and the periphery. And just please note for a moment that obviously the center is very hot, very well connected. But there are little hubs. You see one there, you see one there, you see one there, and you see one there. Stratford is actually one of the few well-connected hubs in East London. I'm building up here, before coming to the project, a series of layers: the social, the spatial, the connectivity one, and now the economic, to understand why the Olympics project was located there and how it was designed. We've also got to remember that London is one of the global hubs of economic power, but it's also incommensurately powerful in terms of the national economy. And despite everything, and clearly COVID will affect things, but Brexit even more, London still grows, mainly through migration, but also through demographic growth, more people having more children in the city. And there are different scenarios. It was very interesting to hear, Alan, that Melbourne might go to 11.2 million, I think you said. Well, that's more or less exactly what one of the scenarios is for London over the next 20 or so years. We're roughly at 9 million and it's still growing. So in that sense, it is interesting. It's not the super Asian growth, it's not the African growth, but it is still growth. And this growth is managed and planned by the people responsible for our city. And these are the three mayors that we've had in power over the years. The man at the center, as you know now, is responsible for the national governance and not has moved on from being mayor, Boris Johnson. I worked as an advisor to two of the mayors, and each mayor was tasked with creating a plan for 25-year growth. And again, this is probably the last image I want to show you before we begin to turn to the project itself, but it's fundamental to understanding how the Olympics project fits into a broader vision for the growth of London as an inclusive city. You see here the outline of London, you see the River Thames, and you see the plan as envisaged by Ken Livingstone in 2004 with a lot of little stars. And the stars are these ex-industrial areas, empty land, which are defined as opportunity areas. As long as there is good public transport, basically there's more investment, more growth in encouraged in these areas. And you'll see that there are two corridors, one going north and east and one going east, which is exactly where there is greater level of deprivation. So this image here, you can call it a physical plan, but it actually is a social plan. And the Olympic project, which is physically located right there, fits into this social vision. There are many of these opportunity areas scattered around London, and as I've already shown you, quite a few of them are in the east. But this plan has meant that all sorts of different areas across London have intensified by design over the last 15 or so years since we've had the London plan in place. And every 5 years, a new mayor comes along and let's say modernizes, updates this plan, and broadly speaking, exactly the same principles have been adhered to. So this is an image of the City of London, the financial hub. This is actually what's happening to it today. This is an image of another area in the more central part of London, another railway development, ex-railway lands in King's Cross. This is an image of what's actually happening on the ground. And actually, this is a view taken yesterday morning from a helicopter showing how densely this site has been developed. And the connection is where there is good public transport, more density is not only allowed, it is required so that you don't underuse the potential of these sites. So the ambition is to take the purple, let's say, in terms of public transport and spread it east and west. And that's why a major infrastructure project of public transport, which is just about completed. We've had a few technical problems, so it hasn't opened yet. It's called the Crossrail project, or the Elizabeth line, which, as you see, cuts across from west, way west, beyond London, all the way through East London, through some of the poorest areas. Let me show you the impact of this sort of planning in terms of development potential, because this is exactly what lies behind the Olympic project. Canary Wharf is a completely privately financed project in the east of London, started in the 1980s. Crossrail has been provided, even though it's not operational, but there's a station by Norman Foster there. This is what the area right next to Canary Wharf was like, and it had planning permission for relatively modest levels of new offices over time. The result of Crossrail has meant that this is the planning volumes that are now allowed, of which a large percentage will be housing, and of that large percentage, over 35% will be affordable housing. So whether we think this is a good thing or a bad thing to do, it certainly allows London to intensify and to provide some of the housing facilities for which we are in desperate need. Again, this is a view taken only a few days ago of the area as it's now developed, much more mixed than Canary Wharf used to be. This is a long introduction to the Olympics project, but I think it's important for you to understand where we're coming from. And I will now focus and zero in on Stratford itself, its location, and what has happened there in the last decade or so. So Stratford is one of those hotspots, as you've seen, of well-connected areas. And in fact, a number of developers, nothing to do with the Olympics, if you see the dates here, before the Olympics was even, that London decided to bid for the Olympics was even conceived, had identified it as a sort of new development area for something called Stratford City. In fact, planning permission was given. I showed you before that it's already incredibly well connected. So with empty land there was enormous potential just waiting to happen. So well connected, both in terms of the rest of London, but also outside. So when in 2005, London unexpectedly actually won the Olympics for 2012, therefore 7 years to go, it made total sense that the focus should be on this one site in East London. And we also had the advantage of things that happened before, and of course lessons learned later, that the legacy of many of these short-term investments have never worked. Athens in particular, I'm sorry to say, spent a lot of money on venues that were just abandoned and never used again. Rio, which happened later, is another example of, instead of contributing to the social inclusion of the city, actually created yet another massive private ghetto behind walls. So the key concept that the British government used to, in a way, also bring people with them, let alone allow the investment of many billions of pounds, many billions of dollars to the area, was one of convergence. This is an important concept, and you can see it written there. The idea was that if you invest X into this part of London, within 20 years, the communities who host the 2012 Games will have the same social and economic chances as their neighbors across London. Think of that red and green map, the deprivation map. It basically means try and spread the green across the 4 or 5 boroughs. So let's look carefully at the site together to understand how it was planned and how it fits into this broader framework that I've described. This whole area was a disused railway lands. You can see it right in the middle, and it's been carved up. You can see railways, motorways all around it. You can see in the distance over there, looking east, the City of London, the financial hub. This is a picture taken in 2005. And all around it, a sea, in some cases, of social housing, typical London terraces, all with very different and diverse communities living there. In some cases, East Asian, very active communities. In some cases, high unemployment, white working class, relatively embittered communities in this part of Hackney, and other assets in the area around. This is what it looked like in 2003. Lots of warehouses, there you see on the right-hand side, many people's fridges and other equipment just stored there, but a sort of bucolic, rather beautiful nature with the canals that flow through the site. There's a large amount of water leading down to the River Thames. And I've mentioned the richness of the communities around it. You have to the north and east in Walthamstow a black African Caribbean concentration. You have in other areas Asian, Indian, Pakistanis, very much the sort of pepper-potted type of development around local hubs that is so typical of London. But apart from nature, which you see here, you also had these electricity pylons marching all the way across the site, making it literally uninhabitable. I mentioned before, and this is an important image, I'll come back to it later, that it was used as a dump. A lot of the site, cities need dumps, rubbish yards in many ways. I'm sure that my fridge is somewhere there. In a moment, when I show you the velodrome, it's exactly where this picture was taken, the velodrome for the Olympics, where it was built. So when it came to the Games, the first thing that was introduced in the language, the planning language, was the notion of legacy. In other words, never talk about the planning for the site just for 2012, as Alan has said, for the 2 weeks of the Olympics and the 2 weeks of the Paralympics, but talk about it as a long-term legacy plan. And what you see here was, in fact, the first image, the first design. I was part of the jury, which, in fact, gave the prize to what was then Foreign Office architects, who will be very familiar, I think, to some of you, in fact, sitting in the room and listening to this talk. They won the first competition and teamed up with other teams, Edor and Allies and Morrison. But the image on the right, which is of the current master plan, and I'll come to that in a second, is significant to understand the ownership patterns and how the project evolved. The dotted red line that you see around there, across the site, all around the site, the dotted red line was the land that central government, through the Olympic Delivery Authority, compulsorily purchased from all the landowners who were there. This is a fundamental tool that you can use when you have projects of national importance, like this one, or an airport, or a railway, or something. You can use this political mechanism to purchase from private owners their land. They have to sell it to you, but at a commercial rate. The land within the dotted line is still owned today by the public interest. In fact, it's owned by the Mayor of London and an agency called the London Legacy Development Corporation. The aspiration of the Olympics is summarized by this very, very simple drawing, done in fact by the architects Kees Christiansen, working on the original competition. We all know that the Olympic 2-week event is a closed event. It lasts 2 weeks. You pay lots of money to go in. Security is a major issue. And sometimes these places remain like that. So the concept that actually after the games, you shift to something which connects with the rest of the city was very much part of the overall plan. And that's why those of us involved in evaluating the different competitions were so taken by this approach. It completely fits in, and that's my point. That's why I spent some time describing where London is going politically, culturally, socially. This diagram fits into that wider DNA. Just a few facts and figures to have in your mind. The budget from central government was nearly £8 billion. A lot more was also put into transport, and roughly 30% was built on the venues, the stadia, 30% on regeneration, and then 30% on buying land and providing security for the event. Now, that last line at the bottom is really quite important for everyone to remember. London is a rich city. It has a massive turnover in terms of GDP. And if you take the amount of money that was actually spent on the Olympics over 7 years, it's about 1 to 2% of its GDP. So if there is a social long-term gain to be had by these investments, is it worth that level of investment? Obviously, I'm biased. The answer is yes. The project could be any project that you at the School of Architecture are dealing with now. It's how do you deal with a gash in the city? And what you can see here from this diagram is literally the urban fabric of everything around this railway lands, the empty railway lands. And you can see the very diverse fabric, very typical of London around it. Interestingly, in the bottom down here on the left-hand side, where I'm going with the mouse, you can see Canary Wharf and see how different it looks from everything else around it. It literally is a sort of ghetto of corporate businesses with a wall around it. So the first things that the master planners did, and I'm now going to begin to accelerate my talk to take you through the project itself, was to go from a site which literally had only one major road going through it called Carpenter's Lane, because it was designed as a railway yards that did not want to encourage through movement. The first thing the master planners did is actually create 37 different points, different stitches, different connections, cycleways, bridges, pedestrian routes, some vehicle routes, which connected this disconnected part of the city to its surroundings. I think that is one of the fundamental assets. This is a view of what actually happened during the Olympic Games itself, a sort of rather dramatic and beautiful image. But the whole thing was conceived always to be implemented in 3 different stages. On the left-hand side, the site as it was before the games. In the middle, the site as developed for the games itself for those 4 weeks over the summer of 2012. And on the right, the master plan for the legacy, which we can talk about in greater detail in a moment. This is a view of a model by Allies and Morrison done relatively recently, which has something about it which I find intriguing, that you can't exactly tell where the edges of the ownership are in relation to the rest of London. And I think for me, as an urbanist, that is a very, very important part of the success story of this project, and or will be over time. A second one, and this is my attempt at doing an overlay, so forgive the graphics, is an equally significant approach, which is not spatial, but is temporal. That instead of developing the project and intensifying the development around the transport hubs all in one go, therefore maximizing value, which is what you would do if you were a private developer, and bearing in mind that this land is public land, leased over time to different private investors, the whole idea was to do the development as you see in different stages. The white in the period more or less until now, the gray in a sort of second stage, and the green in a third stage, was also to distribute value across the site as a whole. So you begin to get a concept or a sense of those images of London that we saw before, of a series of sort of concentrated hubs and not just one unified plan. So this is zooming out a little bit more, seeing the Olympic site in the context of much of East London. And it does remind us a little bit of that potato diagram before that we saw before. But the concept of time is absolutely central to this discussion. So in the final part of my talk, I want to take you through the site, what happens and what it actually looks like before opening up to discussion with Alan. You remember that the site was crisscrossed by the electricity pylons. Well, if you happen to have £8 billion of public money, this is a good way to begin to spend using it. If you were a private developer, you could never afford to spend $300 million to take these things down, build 2 tunnels underneath the site for the electrical cables, which serve most of central London, to go there so that the electrical supply switched from above ground to below ground. Fundamental in terms of creating an opportunity for regeneration. The site was cleared up. You see this image from a number of years back. In the background, you see Canary Wharf over there. So we're looking south. That is the area where the stadium was going to be built. This is the main canal. And over here is one of the major railway stations, the international railway station serving trains or taking trains to, in fact, Paris, Brussels, and back on the right-hand side to central London. This is a view, not that long after, of how the site was arranged for the games itself. So this is a view taken in 2012. You see that a park has been created in the center, a number of bridges cutting across, velodrome, basketball center, hockey stadia, and the whole thing was designed with one simple idea: only build the permanent venues you need, and all the other temporary sports venues, all the other sports venues should be temporary and therefore could be dismantled. So interestingly, London has never had a velodrome, and Hopkins Architects designed what I think is undoubtedly one of the most beautiful buildings, and it's permanent. It's highly used today. London didn't have an aquatic center, and we'll see ZAHA HADID scheme in a moment. We don't play much outdoor hockey, partly because of the weather. We don't play basketball very much. So all these other structures were temporary. And the studio for the major TV areas was then converted into the building that I've referred to as here east. This is an image taken during the games of where the fridge mountain was that I showed you a few moments ago. So landscaping and pedestrian links absolutely central to the experience of the place. The high quality velodrome by Hopkins, and this notion of retrofitting the site and thinking about what would happen for legacy, for the future, not just for the 2 weeks event, is evidenced across the site. The stadium itself was designed for 80,000 people for the athletic events, but can be and has been retrofitted into a football stadium for West Ham. Quite a lot of cost, but you didn't have to throw the whole thing away. Even the major routes which cut across the site were designed to be retrofitted to become more human scale. Many of you know that the Olympics, you can have anything up to 200,000 people moving from one venue to another at any one time. Therefore, having incredibly wide spaces so that you avoid crushing is very important. This is what it actually felt like on the day. So the major routes, and you can see it here in this image taken during construction, were designed to be wider than you would need in a normal urban condition. You can see it on the bridge down here. You have the white bit, which is permanent, and the browner bit, which was effectively temporary and then dismantled and taken away. Why? Because otherwise you would have just oversized, overscaled public spaces, which would never work in terms of creating a piece of city. I've mentioned before that we don't play much basketball in the UK. Therefore, the structure by Wilkinson Eyre, I think a very beautiful structure, was designed to be literally dismantled. In fact, these images show how it was put together. Importantly, before we go on to walking through the site with you, is this notion of ownership. All these transformations I'm talking about, from the Olympic to the post-Olympic to the legacy mode, as it's called, happened because of this organization was put in place in 2012. In other words, just before the games happened. The notion that there would be a custodian, an owner that took care of the future of all these venues and the land was essential. And today there is this company called the London Legacy Development Corporation, of which the mayor is the key stakeholder. The result of that meant that when, for example, the basketball stadium, which used to be here in this space, was taken down, the London Legacy Development Corporation was able to develop a master plan which was coherent and consistent with the longer-term ambitions of creating mixed-use housing which connected to the park. So on exactly the same site that you see the basketball stadium being taken down is this housing that you can see on the right-hand side. The athletes' village itself is an interesting case study. This is what it looked like during the games. Not the most exciting architecture, let's call it that, but it had to be built in a hurry. 17 different architects actually worked on it, and this is where the athletes stayed. It's one of the highest density new developments in London. It has nearly 4,000 different units. And interestingly, after the games, it was sold to a private developer, just about 50% of it, and the other half was also sold to a affordable housing, social housing landlord. So the effect of this ownership means that today, in fact, 48% of the athletes' village as it was then known, as you see it there, 48% is affordable and 52% is private. But, a very important but, you see that all the housing was done in courtyards. You can see with landscape there. The decision was taken that within each block, sorry, go the other way around, within each block, two sides would be private and two sides would be affordable. In other words, instead of doing what is normally done, putting all the affordable and social housing in the noisiest and least valuable part of the site, there was pepper potting of the affordable across the site as a whole. So when you look at views of this part of city, new part of city, it's not very easy to tell what is social and what isn't. And again, I think that is a fundamental success of this particular project, and it comes down to this longer term planning aspiration. In fact, what we're looking at now is one of the insides of the courtyards, looking at two sides which are actually affordable housing. And here you can hardly tell what is what. And also because at the base of all these 8-story buildings are 3-story maisonettes. You can see that there's an entrance gate at every single point. There's a 3-story maisonette, which is mainly for larger families, mainly therefore affordable. And the upper floors could either be for private rental or for people on waiting lists in the local authorities. These are images of what the area is beginning to look like. It actually is a neighborhood, a piece of city, I'm going to stress that, of course, which is beginning to be inhabited by lots of new residents to London, many of whom have small children. So you're beginning to get a development which is actually incredibly sought after by families with younger children, also because of the high quality provision of schools. The other thing which is happening is that, of course, the venue itself and the sports venues are becoming part of the sales pitch. So you see the image on the right, the view of an apartment, which I'm sure in that case is a private for sale, for rent apartment, with ZAHA HADID's aquatic center as part of the view, part of the assets. Again, you can see this here. And I mentioned the notion of conceiving all these major projects to be then retrofitted for legacy. This was the competition entry by ZAHA HADID in around 2009. Richard Rogers was on the jury, I was also on it, and we were all taken by this very simple scheme with the swooping curve and the swimming pool behind it. But what actually was one of the winning ideas behind it is that during the games, it had these two lateral wings with seating for 17,000 people. But it was conceived by ZAHA and her team to then remove these lateral wings when the Olympics was finished, so that it could become a normal sized pool for everyday use. I actually have to remember, and others who knew ZAHA well will know that she was a woman with strong opinions. When we actually walked during the games to see this building with her, she says, "What's that shit?" She was completely unimpressed by these sort of lateral wings, because that was not something she had personally designed, but they then were removed, and you go into the pool today, and it's exactly what she had in mind. What this means is that this venue, and I said London doesn't have an aquatic center, can be used for major events with about 3,000 seats, not 17,000, but it is also used for about £1.50, £2 by all the people who live in the surrounding community. So it's one of the many assets, together with schools that you see here, health centers and others, which are accessible not just to people living on the site, but much, much more importantly to people living within a sort of 5-6 kilometer radius of the site itself. Public space is very much at the heart of this project. You saw that there's a park at the middle of it, but also one of the key issues and one of the key approaches, which I think has been, or hopefully will be successful in the years to come, is this notion of incrementality, thinking of a master plan not as fixed in time, that everything you draw on a piece of paper is it forever. In fact, one of the sites next to the major Olympic stadium, in fact, this site here with the brown images that you see on the left, was originally conceived just to have more and more housing. But it became clear that this part of East London was becoming more and more attractive to other uses and users, including cultural uses. So under Boris Johnson, when he was mayor, a proposal was put together by one of London's major museums, the Victoria and Albert Museum, located in central London, West London, together with a number of universities, a wonderful dance center, and the Smithsonian, the American museum, to actually create in this site a cultural hub, which is now known as East Bank, and is under construction, with BBC also joining with its orchestra. In other words, bringing a completely different type of activity, user type, bringing more life 24/7 than would otherwise have been there. This could have only happened if one had left the door open in terms of the master plan and have that flexibility that I talked about. The International Broadcast Center, which you saw on many of the slides earlier on, is another case in point. It was actually designed as a shed to be cut up, quite literally, and you can see that on the image on the right. This was done, I think, very deftly by the architects Allies and Morrison and then Hawkins Brown. And what it is now is a place which employs nearly 6,000 people. Part of it as an innovation hub, part of it the University College London has what they call the UCL Lab, experimental spaces for engineering and architecture. And also there will be storage facilities for the Victoria and Albert Museum. Unexpected uses, which some of which are actually protected in terms of jobs for people who live in the local community. So here on the right-hand side, you have not just a reuse of a building, so just purely on environmental terms, not wasting resources. You have a park, you have buildings facing out onto it, but you also have a major focus of job creation on one side of the park, which contributes to this major regeneration in terms of the economy of East London, which I referred to at the beginning. There are many ways of measuring success, and the sort of thoughts that one might have at this point is, is just creating jobs enough? Aren't issues of health and well-being just as important? And we can touch upon those in a second. But the mere fact that in a part of London which has always been severely suffering from low employment, high levels of unemployment, in fact, low education, lower life expectancy, literally 8 years less life in East London than West London, those are the numbers we're talking about, have all been and are beginning to be impacted. And here are a few sort of final statistics to keep in mind before we have a discussion. Some of the boroughs that I showed you, the Olympic boroughs, Newham, Hackney, Waltham Forest, Tower Hamlets, I mentioned this at the beginning, were some of the most deprived, not just in London, but in the UK as a whole. And they had the wards, so more specified areas within the boroughs, which were way up at the top. For example, in Hackney, on the left-hand side here of the Olympic site, it had one of the 6th most deprived ward in the UK. And now, only a few years ago, 2015, that same ward has moved up the scale to 50th. In other words, the level of deprivation has become less. Clearly, questions of gentrification are part of the story. There is a new population, more middle class, you saw that from the pictures, moving into an area which, let's remember, was not inhabited. It was completely empty. It's not that people have been displaced as such, but clearly the impacts of a neoliberal economy mean that people are able to sell their properties and move out, or feel the pressure and therefore the same is actually happening. But not everything has worked. This is a diagram showing levels of child obesity, one of the signs of deprivation, and the levels of child obesity in the boroughs on the around the Olympic site have remained unacceptably high. Over 40% of children aged 10 to 11 are still obese. So in other words, the aspiration of improving the health of the young population here hasn't necessarily worked. And you have the classic double-sided coin, double-edged sword, whatever you want to call it, of urban regeneration. Artists who occupied the cheap buildings in this area for decades are now being forced out because buildings like the one on the left are being spruced up or knocked down and rebuilt. On the other hand, the canal side culture of drinking and hanging out has made this part of London a popular destination where a lot of young people want to be, want to live, and want to hang out. And the public space itself is incredibly well maintained. And the connectivity that I talked about right at the beginning is central to its success. So if I summarize with these last slides, the project, going from an empty railway land with, not that much to get you excited, to this image of what actually happened in the games, to this image of where we are now and where we might be in the next 10, 15 years, there is, I hope you can feel, a connection between the longer term ambitions of where London is going, trying to make it more inclusive, trying to deal with this deep set structural deficiency of the East-West divide, but also recognizing that you need to do these things slowly. You can't do it overnight, that if you're going to make a new piece of city, you're bound to make mistakes. Not everything will be done perfectly, but at least if there's this longer term vision, Alan, in place, which guides where you're going, the chances of sort of fucking it up are probably limited. And that's where I'll stop. Thanks very much.
Well, thanks very much for that, Ricky. We've got, I think we've got about 25 minutes left, if that's okay. And there's already some questions come in that I'll turn to in a second. But there's a couple of things I just wanted to highlight. First of all, I'm a bit upset you never pointed out the best building in the site, which is a small black brick building. That's a substation. But anyway, I'll go over it. Can
I go back to that slide?
Yeah, look, it was fantastic to see. I mean, I left actually the UK just after the Olympics themselves and came to Melbourne. So it's really fascinating to see what's happened. And I mean, I had some of the advantages of being on site very early on in 2007 because of some of the infrastructure work. So it's incredible just to see that transformation over time. One of the things I think is really interesting, just when you look at the landscaping alone, and I've read this somewhere, and correct me if I'm wrong, but the remediation work, I read somewhere that was at 95% of the soil, the contaminated soil, was retained on site, cleaned, sieved, and reused to sculpt that landscape, which is quite an incredible feat of engineering. Yeah,
that is correct. That the decision was made. You can imagine decades of not just railway use, but also many of the warehouse facilities that were there, were dripping rather unpleasant substances into the ground. Normally what would have happened is that the earth would have been scooped up and shipped somewhere else. And again, this, Alan, is one of the advantages of having public funding. The decision was taken, no, we must prove that we can be more sustainable. And there were these two extraordinary earth washing machines doing everything on site. So yes, the earth itself was cleaned on site and then resculptured in a way to create those berms and the variegated topography which I think is one of the greater assets in terms of design relating to the canals and to the water at the center of the site.
Yeah. Now, one of the things I think is really important is the conversation around affordability. And I know the world over, it's a complex issue and it varies in terms of what people define as affordable. I mean, one of our greatest challenges here in Melbourne, but also right across Australia, is the shortfall, significant shortfall in social affordable housing. And I mean, Fisherman's Bend, to give you an example, within the framework is targeting 6%. So,
Six.
I mean, 6, yeah, 0, 6, yeah, not 16, 6. Now, I mean, I think it's fascinating considering that London's perceived as one of the most expensive cities globally, that, I mean, the mayor has set targets of 50%. Now, I'm fascinated by that socially and physically. I mean, when you think about trying to get 50%, it does suggest that density or verticality becomes the solution. I'm just interested to understand, I mean, I know there was particular targets at the outset, but how are you modelling, and maybe not just in Olympic Park, across London alone, how are we managing to reach those 50% targets given the challenges here in Australia?
Well, you know, first of all, if you ask 10 people the same question now, you'll get 10 different answers, okay?
Yeah.
There is absolutely no one will say that we've cracked it. You know, London still has a severe housing crisis. There's an affordability crisis for sure. All I can say, you know, we're not as advanced as our Scandinavian colleagues are, for example, but we're not at the, you know, sort of levels that you've just spoken about, or United States, in terms of low provisions and low expectations. Across London, basically the gamble of which fits into the London plan that I showed, of densifying and increasing the provision of sheer housing units on sites which are well connected, is very much part of what you've just said. So, you know, that image I showed you of Canary Wharf, the new development there, where you suddenly have 8,000 units on a site that might have had maybe 1,000, right? Of these 8,000 units, something like 35% are affordable or social. That for me is a significant plus, right? And it's a positive gesture. But there's a long way to go. And the current London plan under development by Sadiq Khan is actually adding 2 or 3 new aspects to it. First of all, he's adding public land owned by Transport for London and saying all that land, which is not used for railway or subway needs to be put into the pot and must have 100% affordable. In other words, you know, so that's quite radical. The second thing which is happening is that the boroughs themselves are now beginning to once again, and this hasn't happened in Britain for 30, 40 years, certainly before Mrs. Thatcher put a stop to it. The boroughs themselves, if you go across London, if I look out of my window here in Camden, in North London, are beginning to actually build on land that they own, usually in the middle of large housing estates built in the 70s and 60s and 70s, which, as you know, Alan, have a lot of extra and unused land.
Yeah.
So there's this intensification happening across London at a local scale, but the waiting lists are still incredibly long. But this current mayor, in his campaign for re-election, which has now been postponed to May of next year because of COVID, has set a standard of 50% as the minimum requirement, with this elbow room of making decisions on a project-by-project basis, right, as opposed to having it blanket. There's an important point there, because there are some boroughs in London particularly the poorer ones, which already have 70–80% of their housing stock being affordable, right, don't particularly want more affordable housing.
Yeah.
So there's an interesting political, social dynamic, which of course needs to be factored in.
And Ricky, just touching on that a bit more. I mean, I know at the early stages of the Olympic Park, there was some conversation about some brave experiments and things like custom build projects or community land trusts. Are we seeing, I mean, I know the whole site is owned, it's publicly owned, but are we seeing any experimentation in land tenure?
Quick answer is no, in the sense that if, in terms of land tenure, like community land trust, not on this site, the big difference is that the freehold is owned by the London Legacy Development Corporation, which can insist on certain percentages being locked into the planning determination and realization in the future. All those different clusters of housing which have been developed since you were there are in the hands of their commissions won by different consortia of private developers, usually working with social housing providers. And they will negotiate what the percentages are. And that really depends on who's in power as the mayor. Under Boris Johnson, the threshold came down to around 30%. Under Sadiq, it's going to go up again. So I expect the next phases to be closer to the 50% of the athletes' village. But I don't, the answer to your direct question is that there has not been on the Olympic site the level of innovation that you're talking about. It's beginning to happen in other parts of London, but at a relatively smaller scale. Okay,
great. Now, I want to turn to some of the questions because there's quite a lot of questions coming in. And maybe just to answer Ted Baillieu's question, I think that's Ted Baillieu that's asked one about what percentage of both the private and affordable social housing is family friendly? So in terms of transport-based density in Australia, which continues to shun families, particularly young families, the 3-bedroom opportunity is rare and very expensive. I mean, just to give you an example, I mean, a lot of our challenges here is that affordability is pushing families very far out. You know, you're talking in difficult commutes and also by car. So we're pushing a lot of people to the fringes because of this issue of affordability. So in terms of the 3-bedroom family units, is that something you're seeing in terms of the Olympic Park?
So two things there. First of all, it was important that the Olympic project, the experience of the 2012 Games, was car-free. You could not go there unless you were a very, very senior member of the Olympic Committee. You could not go there by car. So everyone who went there, that means millions of people, or sort of millions of people saw it, hundreds of thousands went there, realized that actually you could get there very quickly using public transport. Alan, that then translates into the fact that actually the generation of people who started living there realized they didn't need a car. So in fact, there's an incommensurately high proportion of people who live in those areas who are not using the car parking spaces provided. That's significant because the public transport is excellent, and other things like congestion charging and all that make it unaffordable to use a car. So why have one at all? Number one. Number two, the decision taken, I remember sort of being in the room at the time, in roughly 2009, 2010, when the Athletes' Village was being designed and commissioned. At that time, by the way, with Lend-Lease were part of the equation for a bit, the Australian company. There was a very clear instruction from government that if you looked at the waiting lists of families in need in that part of London, East London, there's a very, very high proportion, particularly of Muslim families, with 3, 4, 5 children. And that the provision should avoid the classic one or two bedroom flat, which then would become sort of soulless place. Therefore, I mentioned this in my talk, the fact that the lower 3 floors of each of those 8 to 10-story buildings are literally maisonettes with 4 or 5 bedrooms, 4 bedrooms mainly, right? Over 3 floors with a small front and a slightly bigger back garden, means that they're all, nearly all, gone as part of the affordable offer for the local authorities to place families on the waiting list. I think that's been an unexpected success, because you get the social mix in plan and in section as a result of that.
And can I just a question on the social infrastructure? I mean, is the existing schools, are they the supply and demand? Was there any need to actually add?
So the first thing, so existing schools on site, there were none, right? On the site, there was nothing. There was no school, no health center. There was just empty fridges and McDonald's warehouses, you know? And there hardly any housing at all. One of the buildings, there's a circular green building designed by Alfred Hall Monaghan, is a school for 2,000 students from the age of 6 to 18. When that was built, already by the 2013, it was operational as what we call an academy. So it's one of these new high achieving schools, but open to anyone in the hinterland. Was occupied mainly, Alan, by people living not on the site, because no one was living on the site yet. So this higher quality education, not to mention all the other provisions like cycle center, swimming, health center, etc., were really used and are used more by people living outside the site than in the site. That will change over time as more people come and live on the site itself, as the number of units actually increase. But that mix and that connectivity, being able to walk to the school from Walthamstow or Leighton and at 8 in the morning and being able to walk home in the afternoon is really part of that success. So the educational standards are beginning to go up quite noticeably in the area. Great.
Now I'm just going to go to a question from, and forgive me because it's a fairly big one, which doesn't surprise me, from Andy Fergus. So Andy's saying that he's seen Oliver Wainwright give a compelling lecture about the displacement of industrial and blue-collar jobs from the precinct, as well as adjacent precincts outside of the master plan. So tracking these occupations to well outside of London, he's interested in the comparative analysis of lost employment for low-income communities versus the new innovation jobs, i.e. for whom are the new jobs created, and what are the regional flow-on effects being outside of the epicentre on net of specific public investment. There's a PhD in there, I think.
No, I mean, obviously, Ollie Wainwright is putting his finger, pointing his finger at this site as one of the absolutely classic processes of urban change in a neoliberal context, which is some things suffer and other things benefit. It's a trade-off issue. There are different ways of interpreting, let's say, Ollie's analysis and statistics. Having been on the site before the game, before the site was even identified for the games, and you saw that from some of the images, you can see that a lot of them were large warehouses with maybe 1 or 2 people, 1 or 2 guards there, and not much manufacturing activity, simply because in London there isn't that much. There's been a decline. There are some activities, for example, there's a well-known smoked salmon factory called Foreman, which was on the site, which employed X people, I don't know, 80. And they were actually provided with a new facility on this side of the canal. I see outside the site, but this side of the canal. And that particular business has done incredibly well because of it being relocated. Other businesses were, yes, moved out, but they were provided with new buildings paid for by the government as part of the sort of the agreements around the CPO, the compulsory purchase order. I do not have an answer to the question about how many, let's call it industrial jobs were displaced, but probably most of them is the quick answer. But at the moment, on site itself, on the site, just the site, there's something like 20,000 jobs having been created between here east, what is known as the International Quarter, and a major shopping center, which is on the site itself, which just by itself has created 10,000 jobs, of which many of them are for part-time employment. So a lot of the women who work in the neighborhoods are able to work there during the day and pick up children in the afternoon. So I think before making an analysis like that, you need to look at it in the context of, what are the demographics and the economic profile of London as a whole, and what has happened to the sort of manufacturing and industrial jobs generally. I am sure the answer is that they have been misplaced, but the sheer number of new jobs created on site will outweigh those jobs by a significant factor. But I'm not defending it. I'm acknowledging that tension, but that, that will happen on any of these major sites. But I don't think one can overestimate the actual number of jobs. I don't know how many people were employed across this very, very large site. And then the question must be, is the current use as a genuine mixed piece of city better?
Yeah. Now, Donald Bates has asked a question which I think is also an important one for us as a university. I mean, the role of UCL fascinates us as an academic community, and their presence on the park. And is that something that we were aware of early on, or was that something that happened fairly late on in the process, that interest? And was it tendered as a site? It was an expression of interest.
No, I mean, the point I made, and hi Don, if you're there, good to hear your thoughts. The point I made about having a master plan which is flexible, right, is also part of this discussion. In other words, when in the early days of the planning going into place, but also possible longer term post-Olympic uses were being discussed, in fact, the organization responsible for that was called the London Development Agency, right? And they were fishing around for all sorts of possible things. I can assure you, having been there, not one of them ever thought that a major university would want to locate there, not to mention a museum like the Victoria and Albert Museum or the BBC Orchestra. And absolutely that happened in stages incrementally. The University College London became interested in expanding its own campus, not moving. Let's remember, they're keeping its own business plan was to become, it's already a very large university, but to, I think, double its capacity over, I don't know, 20, 30 years. And therefore they needed land. They, in fact, at first had an interest in something called the Carpenter's Estate, which is immediately to the south of the Olympic site. And then that became highly controversial. So they became interested in another part of the project near the Olympic Stadium itself, which they've now acquired. The question about there would have been an open bid, and they would have bought it from the LLDC for a particular price. Yeah. I don't have the details of that, but I think all of that is quite public, given that these are public institutions.
Great. Now, I'm going to have to apologise to everyone because we've got a lot of questions, and I'm keen to just shift the conversation slightly away from the Olympic Park and more onto the urban age. I mean, it is 15 years this year since you started that research. It's been an incredible legacy already in terms of the conferences and publications. I'm curious what's next. I mean, a lot of the research has looked at growth, and particularly around Africa and Asia in the future. We have got a moment of reflection right now, quite an interesting pause as we all face up to COVID and how we transition through it. But I'm just interested to hear what's next for the urban age after 15 years.
Well, thank you for saying nice things about the urban age. And I think in 15 years, we've done a couple of things. You've got to remember that the London School of Economics is a school of policymakers and economists. So the mere fact that we've been able to bring the spatial into the discussion, I think, is an intellectual important step. And the fact that the Urban Age conferences, as you said at the beginning, and our research itself puts physical, spatial, architectural, design issues alongside economic, social, and governance issues is probably one of the things that we can be most proud of. And that's, of course, translated into a teaching tool, an educational vehicle. So in terms of the what next, we're working much more now on even executive education and training mayors and decision makers through executive MSCs or concentrated programs, which might be for regional planners. I mean, one of the great models here is your own city architect, Rob Adam, who I can sniff in the air, I think, in this particular moment, who showed what one person can actually do. And I have to say, Alan, in terms of reaching out with the urban age, with the data that we've now put together and the evidence that one has that if you take certain decisions, you can implement sustainable change, needs to be understood more and more by the policymakers than by the designers themselves. So that's an area we're actively working on. And allied to that, we slightly shifted at the moment from just holding more and more conferences, because we've done 17 or so. The last one we held was in Addis Ababa. We shifted to actually working with city governments as a task force. So we're now working with the city of Addis Ababa and the mayor's office, and the city of Athens and the mayor's office on very particular areas, bringing our own expertise to help them think through and improve the way they plan things and deliver things. So, I'm not saying we certainly work with many others on putting cities on the map. Now it's trying to focus very much on how can better decisions be taken on the ground.
I mean, I think over the last few months, I mean, city governance has become such a focal point of globally. We're all glued to the television at the moment, watching what's happening across the world. And I think you've said in the past, you've talked about London being quite slim in its kind of administrative governance. Can you point us to a very particular model of governance globally outside of London that you think is working really well? A model that maybe looking at growth in particular.
I think the one lesson that we've learned over the years is that whether it's a mayor or governor, forget about the term, but to have an alignment of jurisdiction between where people live and who makes the decisions and where taxes are paid is fundamental. Again, I will not forget being with Rob, where he was showing me in Melbourne where things had been done, densification had happened and all that. And then he pointed at the end of the street, he said, but beyond that line, it's got nothing to do with me. It's got nothing to do with us. It's another jurisdiction. I think the answer to your question, Alan, is when, remember that very first image I showed you of that density map of London in the greater southeast of England, right? and where the built form sort of stops, where people live stops. That is roughly the line where the Mayor of London has authority. That is exactly the line where the London Plan actually defines what should be happening in spatial, economic, and other development terms. So the critical thing is to have one agency which is responsible for that. Let me give you, if we have time, for example, in New York, the city mayor is not responsible for transport. It's the governor of the state, right? In Mexico City, only 1/3 of the city is actually, of its population, 22 million. Only 1/3 is actually in the hands of the mayor. So the mayor and the neighbors always fight. So I think that coherence of alignment is very important. And I think in Australia, you suffer often from that, not having that clear alignment. And taxation is fundamental. You know, you've got to be able to tax the people and give them a choice as to what their preferences are, and then you can actually follow up with policies that work.
Now, Ricky, can I squeeze in one last question? I'm conscious we're getting up to the 7:30 here and probably 10:30 your time. So one last question, which is Jane Holmwood, who's Executive Director of Department of Environment, Land, Water and Planning, has asked a question about the role of design and how we get politicians to see the benefit of design. Now, I mean, this is obviously something you've mentioned within the London School of Economics, is bringing spatial knowledge and visualising data and bringing that to mayors and people who are in control of the governance of cities. I mean, I think that's been an endless battle of your own. I mean, you can see that in Olympic Park, the role of design. I think there was 15 competitions, design competitions across the park. Do you think things have changed at all in London off the back of the Olympics in terms of the broader agenda around design thinking and attitudes to good quality design?
Are you in London or in general?
Well, look, I think both. I mean, I think the impact of the Olympics and its wider impact across decision-making in London, do you think it's been transformational outside of the park? But then, well, yes.
I was part, I mean, I ended up being in that position because I was part of a group, which was an advisory group to the Mayor of London, headed originally by Richard Rogers, which was called the Architecture and Urbanism Unit. And then it was rebranded a bit later on into something called Design for London. And the mere fact that actually such a small group exists and sort of still exists today with a slightly different name and all that, and is able to have a voice even within the mayor's office is really quite significant. So I don't think someone like me could have had that role or that position if there weren't a sort of slightly wider initiative. Has it had an impact, that sort of type of activity? Yes, I think there's no doubt that across London over the last 15 years, the quality, and particularly the quality of housing, Alan, in local authorities has gone up enormously. The quality of public space has been prioritized in ways that I don't think was 25 years ago. And this is not just the public client. I think the private sector has moved alongside, sometimes faster in understanding. You know, the King's Cross project that I showed is exemplary, I think, from many of these points of view, not possibly even better than the Olympic project, but they are not unique. I mean, I think there are positive examples across the board. But you do have to make an enormous effort to translate complex architectural ideas into languages understood by policymakers, and to get policymakers to understand that space is political.
Fantastic. Look, I think we'll need to wrap up there. I mean, I think there's a whole series of other questions I've not even managed to get to yet, which just shows the level of interest in the presentation. So, look, a huge thank you on behalf of the faculty and the university. We really appreciate you taking the time out to talk to us. We're watching with great interest what's happening in London. Particularly, I'm interested in Brexit and how it will unfold after COVID. But we'll also watch with great interest how urban age transforms over the next 15 years. Hopefully it will keep going under your watch. So really appreciate it. There's a lot of challenges going on in Melbourne, and it'd be great to keep a dialogue going as we too look at an incredible growth projection and doubling the population over the next 30 years. Now, I'm just going to take a minute to thank everyone, all the participants, for staying with us. We've had a great turnout tonight, some fantastic questions. I do just need to highlight that we have another talk next week. We'll be hosting Anna Nojaki, Associate Professor of Architecture at MIT. This has been the 5th in our series of talks. We're really pleased. We're getting people from all over the world actually joining in, and really getting really diverse audiences. So thank you once again, and we look forward to seeing you next week.